Today I will tell you a story about a woman trapped in a town ruled by her cruel sheriff husband who makes a choice that will seal her fate. She risks everything to free an innocent Native American hunter, and together they must flee into the unforgiving wilderness with the most powerful man in the territory hunting them down. Let's see if we can gather 100 likes for this dramatic story. The cold iron of the keys felt impossibly heavy in Martha's trembling hand. Each tremor threatened to create a jangling sound that would shatter the thick silence of the sheriff's office. Upstairs, her husband, Sheriff Brody, slept the self-satisfied sleep of a man convinced of his own power. Down here, in the oppressive dark of the jail corridor, a different kind of power was being tested. Before her stood Ennepe, the Blackfoot hunter, his dark eyes watching her every move. There was no gratitude in his gaze, only a deep, guarded suspicion. She could not blame him. Why would the sheriff's wife risk everything for a stranger her husband had condemned? She held out the heavy revolver and a small canvas bag. Her voice, when it came, was a barely audible whisper. "You must go. Now." He took the items without a word, his movements fluid and silent, a stark contrast to her own ragged nerves. They slipped out into the moon-drenched street. The familiar town of Redemption, a place she knew down to its every splintered boardwalk, was now a hostile landscape of shifting shadows. Every creak of a floorboard from a nearby saloon, every distant howl of a coyote, sent a spike of fear through her heart. Ennepe moved ahead, a silhouette against the pale dust, his steps making no sound. He was a creature of this silent world, while she was an intruder. Martha clutched her shawl tighter, her lungs aching for a full breath she dared not take. This was it, the first step away from the gilded cage she had called home. She did not know if this was courage or madness, but she knew with chilling certainty that there was no turning back. The life she had known was over, burned to ashes by this single desperate act. Their escape was a frantic dash into an unforgiving unknown. As they reached the edge of town, the vast, open prairie stretched before them like a dark sea. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying scents of sage and distant rain. For the first time, Ennepe spoke. His voice was low and resonant, like stones shifting in a deep riverbed. "He will follow." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Martha nodded, her throat too tight for words. She knew her husband better than anyone. His pride was a fearsome, living thing. This escape was not just an affront to his authority as sheriff. It was a deep, personal betrayal he would never forgive. He would not send a posse. He would lead it himself, fueled by a righteous fury that would burn everything in its path. She glanced back at the faint lights of Redemption, a town that saw Brody as a hero, a bastion of the law. They would never believe the truth. Ennepe set a relentless pace, heading for the broken lands to the east, where rocky outcrops and winding canyons could offer some cover. Martha struggled to keep up, her city shoes useless on the rough terrain, her lungs burning with the effort. He did not slow for her. His silence was a wall, his focus absolute. Was he testing her, or did he simply not care if she fell behind? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. She had freed him, but that did not make them allies. In his world, she was still the wife of the man who had unjustly imprisoned him. As the first hint of dawn stained the eastern sky a bruised purple, she stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully. He stopped then, turning to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a long moment she thought he would leave her there. The silence stretched, filled only by her ragged breathing. Sheriff Brody's roar of fury echoed through his house as the sun rose, a sound that made his deputy flinch. The empty cell and his wife's vacant room were twin insults that stoked his rage into a white-hot inferno. He did not need to ask what had happened. He knew. In front of his men he crafted a story of a cunning savage who had bewitched his poor, fragile wife, a woman too gentle for this harsh world. His voice was filled with false grief and righteous anger, and the men gathered around him nodded in sympathy, their hands resting on their sidearms. They saw their leader, a war hero, a man of the law, wronged by a heathen. They did not see the cold, calculating cruelty in his eyes. He would hunt them down. not just for justice, but for the sheer pleasure of reclaiming what he considered his property and punishing her for her defiance. As they fled, the memories came for Martha, sharp and cruel as broken glass. She remembered him in a drunken fit of jealousy, his face contorted with rage. He had forced a rough burlap sack over her head, his voice a venomous hiss in her ear. "Your face is too pretty, Martha. It invites trouble. No one should see it but me." The suffocating darkness, the smell of dust and rot, the feeling of his fingers digging into her arms. She remembered the carefully chosen words at dinner parties, compliments that felt like blows, veiled insults only she could understand. And the bruises on her wrists, dark blossoms of pain from when he would grip her too tightly, his control absolute. She had learned to anticipate his moods, to become a ghost in her own home, to avoid his wrath. Now that ghost was running for her life, and Epée had not abandoned her. He walked back to where she lay, his face a mask. Without a word, he knelt and examined her swollen ankle. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his fingers probing the injury with an expert's care. He then looked around, his eyes scanning the landscape. He pointed to a low-growing plant with thick, fleshy leaves. "Crush this. Put it on the skin." He offered no further explanation. Martha, wincing in pain, did as she was told, crushing the leaves between two stones until a thick, cool paste formed. She applied it to her ankle, feeling an almost immediate soothing sensation. He tore a strip of cloth from the bag she had given him and expertly wrapped the wound. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He simply waited, his patience a silent command. She had to find her own strength. The day was a grueling ordeal. The sun beat down on them, and the unforgiving landscape offered little shade. Martha's ankle throbbed with every step, but she refused to complain. She watched Epée, fascinated by his effortless connection to the world around them. He noticed things she would have missed: a faint track in the dust, the nervous flick of a lizard's tail, a subtle shift in the wind. He was a part of this land, and she was a stranger. As dusk began to settle, he finally found them a place to rest. A shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of desert willow. It was not much, but it was shelter. Exhausted, Martha sank to the ground, the day's fear and pain washing over her. She looked at the silent man across from her and wondered what he thought. Was she a burden? An enemy? A fool? He said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon, watching for the pursuit he knew was coming. They saw the dust cloud the next afternoon, a faint plume on the horizon that grew steadily larger. Brody was coming, and he was coming fast. Epée led them into a narrow, winding canyon, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. It was a natural choke point, a place to make a stand. "Stay here," he commanded, pointing to a cluster of large boulders that offered good cover. "Do not make a sound." He moved further up the canyon, finding a higher vantage point that overlooked the entrance. Martha's heart pounded against her ribs. The clatter of hooves on stone grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls until it sounded like a whole army was approaching. She could hear Brody's voice, sharp and commanding, barking orders to his men. They were trapped. The thought was paralyzing. But then she saw Epée, calm and ready, his borrowed revolver held steady in his hand. The first shot was a deafening crack that ricocheted through the canyon. It came from the posse, a wild shot that chipped stone high above Epée's head. He did not fire back immediately. He waited, his patience a weapon in itself. Then, in a moment of stillness, he took aim and fired. A man cried out, his horse rearing in panic. The posse scattered, taking cover behind rocks and scrub brush. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the chaotic sounds of a gunfight. Martha, hidden behind her boulder, felt a surge of adrenaline. This was not a hunt, it was a battle. She remembered the small pair of opera glasses she had packed, in a moment of strange foresight. She pulled them out, her hands shaking, and peered over the rock, trying to spot the hidden rifleman for Epée. "There," she whispered, though he could not possibly hear her. "To the right, behind the dead juniper." As if he had heard her thoughts, Epée shifted his position, firing a single, deliberate shot toward the spot she had identified. There was a yelp of pain, and the shooting from that direction stopped. But they were outnumbered. A bullet struck the rock near Ennepe's head, sending stone fragments flying. He moved again, but not fast enough. Martha saw him flinch, a hand going to his shoulder. He was hit. Desperate, he aimed his revolver not at the men, but at a precarious overhang of loose rock above them. The shot cracked, and with a low groan, a cascade of rocks and dust tumbled down, blocking the narrow canyon path. It would not hold them for long, but it bought them time. When the dust settled and the posse's shouts faded, Ennepe slid down from his perch, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Martha rushed to his side. The wound was high on his shoulder, a clean hole, but it was bleeding steadily. "We must stop the bleeding," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, gritting his teeth against the pain. He guided her hands, instructing her to find a certain type of moss growing in the shaded crevices of the canyon walls. "Press this to the wound, hard." She packed the surprisingly absorbent moss against his shoulder, then used another strip of cloth to bind it tightly. Her fear was replaced by a sharp, focused calm. In that moment, helping the man who was protecting her, she was no longer just the sheriff's wife. She was a partner in this desperate fight for survival. As if on cue, the sky, which had been a brilliant, unforgiving blue, began to darken. The temperature dropped, and a heavy, oppressive stillness fell over the canyon. A storm was coming. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, quickly turning into a torrential downpour that transformed the dusty canyon floor into a muddy river. The rain was a blessing, washing away their tracks and forcing Brody's posse to seek shelter. But it was also a curse, chilling them to the bone and making Ennepe's wound throb with a dull, persistent ache. He led them onward, his movements slower now, until he found what he was looking for. A dark opening in the rock face, the entrance to a long-abandoned prospector's cabin, built right into the cliff. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp earth and old smoke, but it was dry. Ennepe managed to start a small, smokeless fire in the old stone hearth, using dry tinder he had kept wrapped in oilcloth. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, creating a small pocket of warmth and light in the vast, stormy darkness. For the first time in 2 days they were safe, if only for a little while. The shared danger and the intimacy of their small shelter began to break down the wall of silence between them. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and asked the question that had been hanging in the air since they fled. "Why?" Martha took a deep breath, the warmth of the fire giving her courage. She started to speak, not of his innocence, but of her guilt, the guilt of her long silence in the face of Brody's cruelty. She told him things she had never spoken aloud to anyone. She did not speak of the bruises or the bag over her head, but of the deeper wounds. She told him of the cold, dark cellar beneath their house, a place of absolute silence and fear. "For any disobedience," she said, her voice a low murmur, "a misplaced book, a word spoken out of turn, he would lock me there." She described the gnawing hunger, the damp chill that seeped into her bones, and the utter despair of being forgotten by the world. He would feed her scraps from his own table, a king dispensing charity to a beggar, until she was broken enough to plead for a forgiveness she did not need. Ennepe listened without interruption, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He did not offer pity, but something far more valuable. He offered belief. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the small cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain outside. Ennepe then told her a story from his people, a legend of the coyote spirit, a clever trickster who valued freedom above all else and would endure any hardship to remain untamed. He spoke of how the coyote would chew off its own leg to escape a trap, choosing a life of pain and imperfection over the certainty of capture. "To be in a cage," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "is to not be alive." Martha understood. He was not just telling her a story, he was telling her that he understood her choice. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by the storm, a fragile bridge of trust was built between two people from different worlds, united by a shared enemy and a desperate yearning to be free. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the desert landscape glistening. But their small bag of supplies was nearly empty. Ennepe's shoulder was healing, but he was still weak from blood loss. He knew he had to hunt. "I will not be long," he said, his gaze serious. "Stay by the stream. Do not leave it." He disappeared into the brush, moving with a renewed silence that still amazed her. Martha sat by the gurgling stream, the solitude a welcome relief after the constant tension. But the quiet did not last. The sound of cracking twigs made her freeze. Two men emerged from the trees, their clothes rough, their faces unshaven. They were not from Brody's posse. These were bounty hunters, drawn by the promise of the reward the sheriff had undoubtedly placed on both their heads. Their eyes lingered on her, filled with a greedy, predatory light. "Well, look what we have here," the taller one said, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "The sheriff's lost little lady." The other man chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Reward says she's with a savage. You see a savage around here?" They advanced on her slowly, savoring her fear. Martha's mind raced. The revolver Enipe had left with her was tucked into her waistband, but it felt 1,000 miles away. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. These men saw her as an easy prize, a helpless woman who had strayed too far from home. The terror that had been her constant companion under Brody's roof rose up, threatening to choke her. She was a victim again, cornered and alone. The world seemed to shrink to the space between her and the two menacing figures. Just as the first man lunged for her, a shadow detached itself from the trees. Enipe moved with a speed that was not quite human. He was a blur of controlled fury. Before the man could even register his presence, Enipe's arm shot out, striking him hard across the side of the head. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. The second bounty hunter, stunned, fumbled for his sidearm. He was too slow. Enipe closed the distance in 2 silent strides, disarming him with a swift, brutal motion that sent the weapon flying into the stream. He did not kill them. He used their own ropes to bind them tightly, leaving them helpless and sputtering threats. The entire encounter was over in less than a minute. He stood over the bound men, his chest heaving slightly, the only sign of his exertion. He turned to look at Martha, who was still frozen, her hand clutching the revolver she had failed to draw. The look in his eyes was not one of triumph, but of something colder, more assessing. He had saved her, yes, but the incident had laid a hard truth bare between them. She was still a liability. Her fear had paralyzed her. As long as she was helpless, she would always be a target, always be dependent on him to be her savior. A hot wave of shame washed over her, followed by a surge of fierce determination. She would not be a victim anymore. She met his gaze, her own eyes hardening. "Teach me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Teach me how to fight. Teach me how to survive. I will not be helpless again." A flicker of surprise, then respect, appeared in his eyes. He gave a single, slow nod. Her training began the next day. It was not about fighting with her fists, but about becoming a part of the landscape, just as he was. Enipe started with the most basic lesson, silence. He made her walk behind him for hours, pointing out every time a snapped twig or a dislodged pebble betrayed her presence. "The land speaks," he told her. "You must learn to listen, not to shout over it." At first it was maddeningly difficult. Her body, accustomed to rustling skirts and leather-soled shoes, seemed determined to make noise. But slowly, she began to learn. She learned to place her feet carefully, to use the contours of the ground to her advantage, to feel the world through the soles of her worn shoes instead of just seeing it with her eyes. The world began to open up to her in a way she had never imagined. He taught her to see. She had always looked at the wilderness as a green and brown blur, but he showed her the details. He pointed out the subtle differences between edible berries and their poisonous lookalikes, the faint scratches on a tree trunk that marked the passing of a deer, the way the grass bent to reveal the direction of the wind. He taught her how to find water by watching the flight of birds in the evening. Her mind, once filled with household ledgers and social niceties, now grappled with the complex living language of the natural world. This knowledge was more than just a tool for survival. It was a form of power. It was something Brody, with all his authority and his guns, could never understand and could never take away from her. The lessons with the revolver were the hardest. The weapon felt alien in her hand, a tool of loud, brutal violence. The first time she fired it, the recoil jolted her arm and the sound made her ears ring. Her shot went wide, kicking up dust far from the rock he had designated as a target. "You are not trying to kill the rock," he said, his voice calm. "You are trying to guide the bullet. It is an extension of your will. Your will is strong. Let the bullet follow it." They spent days on it. He showed her how to stand, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly instead of pulling it. Slowly, her shots grew steadier. The day she finally hit the target, a clean strike that sent a chip of stone flying, a small smile touched Ennepe's lips. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile. As they traveled, a new dynamic formed between them. They were no longer just a protector and his ward. They were a team. She learned his silent signals, a slight tilt of the head, a specific hand gesture, and he began to rely on her sharp eyes and quick mind. One evening, as they sat by their small fire, she was cleaning the revolver, her movements now practiced and sure. He was watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "You are not the same woman I met in that jail," he said quietly. Martha looked up, meeting his gaze across the flames. "No," she agreed, her voice firm. "That woman is gone." And for the first time, she did not mourn her past self. She was becoming someone new, someone forged in hardship and freedom, and she would not trade it for anything. They had been on the run for weeks, moving north, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Brody's reach. They had survived, but it was a life of constant vigilance, of looking over their shoulders. One night, huddled by a fire in the shelter of a rocky overhang, Ennepe voiced the thought that had been troubling them both. He will not stop. Brody's obsession was not just about his wife or an escaped prisoner. It was about his power. As long as they were free, they were a living testament to his failure, a loose thread that could unravel the entire fabric of his authority. They could run for the rest of their lives, but they would never truly be safe. A sense of despair settled over Martha. Was this their fate? To be hunted forever? Always looking for shadows in the dark? She stared into the hypnotic dance of the flames, her mind drifting back to the oppressive luxury of the sheriff's house. She thought of his office, the seat of his power, filled with hunting trophies and law books. And then, an image surfaced, sharp and clear. It was the massive, ostentatious portrait of Brody's stern-faced father that hung on the wall. She remembered a night, years ago, when Brody had been deep in his cups, celebrating a successful land deal. He had bragged, his words slurred, about his insurance policy. He had gestured grandly at the portrait. "No one ever looks behind the old man," he had chuckled. "But that is where the real power is." At the time, she had dismissed it as drunken rambling. Now, the words came back to her with stunning clarity. "The safe," she whispered, her voice tight with excitement. Ennepe looked at her, his head tilted in a silent question. "There is a safe, behind the portrait of his father." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Brody's sudden wealth, his political connections, his ability to make problems simply disappear. It was all connected. She remembered him poring over ledgers late at night, his face illuminated by a single lamp. "He keeps records of everything," she said, her voice growing stronger. "False reports to the territorial governor, ledgers of bribes, proof of his land schemes. It is all there. It is the source of his power." She looked at Ennepe, her eyes wide with the enormity of her realization. They had been running from the monster, when all along, they held the key to destroying him. A new plan began to form, audacious and incredibly dangerous. Running was no longer the answer. The only way to achieve true freedom, to be safe from him forever, was to cut the serpent's head off. They had to go back. Back to redemption, back to the heart of Brody's power, and steal the evidence that would expose him for the corrupt tyrant he was. The thought was terrifying. It meant walking back into the cage she had just escaped. But this time, she would not be a prisoner. She would be a warrior, armed with knowledge he never knew she possessed. She explained the idea to Ennepe, expecting him to refuse, to call her mad. Instead, he listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he gave a single, firm nod. "We go back." Returning to the outskirts of Redemption was a surreal experience. The town they approached under the cover of darkness was the same, yet entirely different. Before, it was her prison. Now it was a fortress they had to breach. They learned from a talkative farmer on the road that a traveling circus, a rare and exciting event, was set to perform in town that very night. It was a stroke of luck, a perfect diversion. The entire town would be gathered on the main square, their attention fixed on the acrobats and clowns. The sheriff's office, usually a hub of activity, would be quiet, perhaps even empty. It was a risk, but it was the best chance they would get. They needed a disguise, a way to move through the streets without being instantly recognized. They found what they needed on a clothesline behind a small farmhouse. A worn pair of overalls and a straw hat for Ennepe, a simple, dark dress and a bonnet for Martha. The clothes were rough and smelled of soap and sunshine. Dressed in her borrowed attire, Martha felt anonymous, a plain farming woman, invisible. Ennepe, his long hair tucked under the hat, his proud features shadowed by the brim, could pass for a hired hand. They waited in a thicket of cottonwood trees as dusk fell, watching the townspeople stream toward the bright lights and cheerful music of the circus. The sounds of laughter and applause drifted toward them on the evening breeze, a stark contrast to the grim tension that held them in its grip. The time had come. They moved through the darkened back alleys, a silent, coordinated pair. Martha's knowledge of the town was their map, guiding them through the maze of narrow passages she had walked 1,000 times before. She pointed out the house with the loud dog, the alley that was a known dead end, the loose board on a small bridge that would rattle if they were not careful. Ennepe moved along the rooftops and in the deepest shadows, a ghost in the night. He was their eyes, his keen senses alert for any sign of a patrol or a curious onlooker. Their communication was wordless, a series of hand signals and shared glances they had perfected during their weeks in the wilderness. Every step brought them closer to the sheriff's office, a squat, imposing building that represented all the fear and power they had come to destroy. The office was dark, but not empty. A single lamp burned in the front window, casting a lonely yellow glow. Peering through the grimy glass, they could see the deputy, a young, eager man named Calloway, asleep at his desk, his chair tilted back, his mouth open. Getting past him would be the first major obstacle. Ennepe gestured toward the back of the building. He had noticed a small window, likely for the storeroom, that was set high on the wall. It was too small for him, but perhaps not for her. The risk was enormous. If Calloway woke up, if anyone saw them, it would all be over. Martha looked at the dark building, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She took a steadying breath, pushing down the fear. She had come too far to turn back now. Ennepe provided the boost, his hands forming a solid platform for her foot. Martha scrambled up the rough wooden wall, her fingers finding purchase on the weathered planks. The window was stiff, but with a surge of adrenaline, she forced it open with a low groan of protesting wood. She slipped through the narrow opening, landing silently on a pile of dusty burlap sacks inside the storeroom. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, gun oil, and stale tobacco. She crept to the door that connected to the main office, her ear pressed against the cool wood. She could hear the deputy's soft, rhythmic snores. Carefully, she turned the knob and eased the door open just enough to slip through. The sleeping deputy was only a few feet away, his face peaceful in the lamplight. The main office was exactly as she remembered it, a monument to her husband's ego. The glassy eyes of a stuffed buck stared down from the wall, and his various commendations were framed and hung with precision. And there, dominating the far wall, was the grim portrait of his father. Her hands trembled as she approached it. It was heavy, the frame ornate and solid. It took all her strength to lift it off its hook and lean it carefully against the wall. Behind it, just as she had remembered, was the black iron door of a wall safe, its brass dial gleaming in the dim light. She knelt before it, her mind racing. Brody had once boasted that the combination was a date, a day of great victory. She thought back, her fingers hovering over the dial. His birthday? Their anniversary? No, it would be something more significant to him. She tried the date of the battle where he had supposedly earned his fame, a story he told at every opportunity. She turned the dial. Right, left, right. The tumblers clicked softly into place. With a surge of triumph, she pulled the handle. The heavy door swung open. Inside were neat stacks of paper, several thick ledgers, and bags of coins. She reached for the ledgers, her fingers closing around the cold leather covers. This was it. The proof. And then, a voice from the doorway, cold and laced with a terrifying amusement. "I knew you would come back for them, Martha. You were always the smart one." She froze, her blood turning to ice. Sheriff Brody stood there, a revolver in his hand, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He was not at the circus. He had been waiting. The sleeping deputy was a ruse. Brody stepped fully into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. His eyes, cold and hard as river stones, were fixed on her. "And you brought your savage pet with you, I presume. Where is he? Skulking in the shadows?" At that moment, the back window shattered inwards as Enepe burst into the room. He had realized the trap. Brody spun around, firing his weapon. The shot went wide, smashing a whiskey bottle on a nearby shelf. The office was plunged into a chaotic symphony of shouting and gunfire. It was not a duel. It was a desperate, close-quarters struggle for survival in a room that had suddenly become a deadly trap, with Martha caught squarely in the middle. The final confrontation had begun. The room descended into a whirlwind of violence. Enepe moved with incredible speed, knocking over the heavy desk to create a barrier between them and Brody. The deputy, Calloway, jolted awake by the noise, scrambled for his sidearm, his face a mask of confusion. Brody, his face a mask of pure rage, fired again, the shot tearing a splintered hole in the overturned desk. "You will not take her from me," he roared, his voice raw with possessive fury. Enepe did not waste a bullet. He was trying to draw Brody's fire, to create an opening for Martha. He knew this was not a fight he could win with guns alone. He was outmatched in the enclosed space. He needed to give Martha the time she needed. He was a distraction, a target, and he was willing to be both. Amid the chaos, Martha's mind worked with a desperate clarity. The ledgers. She had to get the ledgers. She scrambled back to the open safe, stuffing the heavy books into the canvas bag she still carried. Calloway, finally realizing the situation, took aim at Enepe from the side. "Sheriff, look out!" he yelled. Martha saw the movement. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy glass inkwell from the floor and hurled it with all her might. It struck Calloway's hand, sending his revolver clattering across the floor. The distraction was enough. Enepe lunged over the desk, not at Brody, but at the single oil lamp that lit the room. He swiped it from its hook, sending it crashing to the floor. The room was instantly plunged into near-total darkness, the only light a terrifying, spreading pool of burning oil. The fire cast long, dancing shadows, turning the office into a hellish landscape. Brody fired blindly into the darkness, his shots wild and panicked. Enepe used the confusion to tackle the sheriff, a desperate move to disarm him. The two men grappled on the floor, their grunts and curses echoing in the chaotic room. Martha, with the bag clutched to her chest, saw her chance. The back window, the one Enepe had broken, was their only way out. "Enepe!" she screamed over the roar of the flames. He heard her. With a final, powerful shove, he pushed Brody away from him, directly into the path of the dazed deputy. Enepe scrambled toward the window, but a searing pain shot through his shoulder as one of Brody's last blind shots found its mark. He stumbled, but did not fall. He reached the window, and Martha helped pull him through the shattered frame just as the flames began to engulf the office curtains. They landed in the alleyway outside, the sounds of the fire and Brody's enraged shouts fading behind them. They did not look back. With Martha supporting the wounded Enepe, they disappeared into the labyrinthine alleys, melting back into the night. They left behind a burning office, a town roused by the spreading fire, and a tyrant whose empire was about to crumble into ash. They had the proof. They had their freedom. And though they were both wounded and exhausted, they had each other. The long night was finally over, and a new day, a day of their own making, was about to begin. It took them 2 days of hard travel to reach the next county and the office of a federal judge, a man known for his integrity and his dislike of corrupt local lawmen. Martha, her face smudged with dirt but her eyes clear and determined, presented the scorched ledgers. The judge listened to her story in silence, his expression grim as he examined the damning evidence of Brody's crimes. He asked few questions, his sharp gaze assessing her credibility. He saw not a hysterical woman, but a person who had endured an incredible ordeal and emerged with undeniable proof. By the time she finished speaking, he had already summoned his marshals. There was no hesitation. The law, the real law, was finally going to come to redemption. They did not stay to witness Brody's downfall. Their part in the story was over. They traveled north, into the vast, open territory that was home to Ennepe's people. As his shoulder healed, he taught her the names of the constellations that glittered in the enormous night sky, stories and legends far older than the town of redemption. She, in turn, read to him from one of the few books she had managed to save, her voice soft in the quiet of the evening. The horrors of their past began to recede, replaced by a shared peace that was more profound than any words they could speak. They were two survivors from different worlds, bound together by a shared fight and a quiet, growing affection that needed no grand declarations. When they arrived at the Blackfoot camp, nestled in a valley carved by a winding river, they were greeted not with suspicion, but with a quiet curiosity. Ennepe was home, and his word was respected. He told his people of Martha's courage, of her fight against the man who had wronged them both. They saw the strength in her, the resilience that had carried her through the wilderness. They gave her a name in their language, Woman Who Walks with the Wind, for she had come to them out of a great storm. She learned their ways, not as an outsider, but as one of them, her clever mind and gentle spirit, earning her a place by their side. She found not just a sanctuary, but a family, a community bound by respect and tradition. Months later, word reached them from a traveling trader. Sheriff Brody had been tried and convicted, his name now a curse in the town that had once revered him. The news was a distant echo, a story from another life. Martha stood with Ennepe on a ridge overlooking the valley, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The wind gently stirred her hair, and she felt a sense of peace she had never known. Their scars remained, a reminder of the price of their freedom. But here, in the vast, untamed beauty of the land, they had built a new life. Their story became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, courage could bloom, and love could find a way to heal the deepest of wounds. They were finally truly free.